So what a good conversation we have just had. We are digging into the realities, the practicalities, the policy and regulatory questions, but also the technology. How are our large institutions, our regional institutions, importantly too, how are our small institutions bringing in the technology and thinking about it very thoughtfully. And I'm really pleased to now be a part of a fireside conversation with Teresa Heitsenrether, who has been appointed, she's going to tell us a little bit about the background, by Jamie Dimon at JPMorganChase to bring in AI. We've all seen he is motivated around the possibilities of the technology, but he needs brilliant people to execute. And Teresa is leading that, I'm assuming, a pretty big team. Yeah. So thank you, Teresa, for joining us.
Great to be here.
Yeah, share a little bit about how you ended up in this position.
Absolutely. Well, again, nice to be here. It's wonderful to see conversations like this. I think it's what's necessary for all of us to progress. So I am probably the least likely Chief Data and Analytics Officer in the banking sector, in as much as I am not a technologist nor a data scientist. So my history is I've worked at JPMorgan for my entire professional career. Almost all of it in our investment bank, running large multi-billion-dollar businesses on a global basis. And a lot of them had a reasonable technology element to them, but this is kind of a little bit of a new space. And the reason for me in the role and actually setting up a completely separate functional unit within the organization is that, you know, we've been doing AI for over a decade. So this is not something that's new. For JPMorgan, we've been deploying AI in many ways, which I think we'll speak more about. But as the technology really started to accelerate and we see these amazing capabilities and the potential for the transformation in our bank, our industry, society more broadly, this is a critical priority for us at the firm. And so Jamie wanted somebody sitting at the operating committee table who did this for a full-time job, not as something separate. So it speaks to the importance of this initiative within the company, but also very intentionally to have somebody with a commercial focus. Having been a P&L owner and run large businesses, this is less about the technology for the sake of the technology. It's about how do we actually apply and deploy that technology to drive outcomes for our bank and our customer base. So I call myself a little bit the translator. I can take the technology and put it into business speak and try to figure out how do we actually deploy that to make it impactful.
Yeah, wonderful. I know you're going to get into some of the specifics. Let's just go right there. You're right, large institution like JPMorgan and others have been using versions of artificial intelligence for decades. This isn't new. Language models are new and offer new possibilities. You all have really jumped into that territory, but what have you seen as successful as you have been deploying AI, old school types, machine learning, newer types? And what are some of the key factors that are really driving that kind of success?
Yes, so when we look at how we're deploying the technology, traditional and generative, I think first and foremost, you have to look at like what are the key economic drivers for a bank. So not surprisingly, the technology lines up very neatly with those. So in traditional, more predictive models, we're using those actively and have been for some time in areas like fraud detection. So think every time you touch your card, when you go to buy a cup of coffee or something, there's AI in the background looking at, is this a fraudulent transaction? So we use it in our call centers. When you call up Chase and you have a question, we're looking at why is this customer calling? Can we get the agent a better response so that you're spending less time on the phone and we're not having to transfer you from person to person? So there's many, many applications where the traditional side, pricing, marketing, customizing offers, being able to create credit cards for people new to credit, for example, with our Chase Freedom card. So lots and lots of ways that it's applied. And when we look at the value that's delivered, and there are places where we can absolutely measure the value, and that's measured from cost reduction, cost avoidance, revenue growth, fraud prevention, all these types of things for ourselves and our customers. There's real economics there. I think when large language models showed up, now all of a sudden you have a very different aperture because you can start to dig into unstructured data. Think, research and call notes and all different ways that you can tap into the insights and the expertise we have in the company. And some of the ways that we're deploying the large language models, which are different, are in areas like our software development. We have 50,000 developers within JPMorgan, so if you can make those people even 10% more effective and efficient in what they do every day, that's very meaningful. We always have a much larger demand book of work than we have capacity, and so you can work on more things. So there's new ways that we're deploying the technology. We think that large language models are really helpful for software development, customer service, marketing, and the other really interesting area is the difference with the large language models is the democratization factor, right? You can give this technology to somebody like me who is not a trained data scientist, who's a business professional, and make it useful in their day-to-day work. And that's what we did. We created something called LLM Suite within JPMorgan, which is effectively just a wrapper around the models that lets our employees use large language models in a safe way, that protects our data, that has all the right governance already built in. And what we've done over the last year is, in addition to giving you capability of just using the model, we've started to plug it into knowledge bases and tools that are relevant to people's jobs. So for example, if you're working in our finance area, we're going to link it into some of our finance databases and give you tools that you would use for forecasting and what have you. If you're a banker, we're going to plug that into our customer knowledge and 10Ks and earnings call transcripts, and we're going to give you a tool that makes you create PowerPoints for customer meetings more quickly. So that customization of the access to the model, but also the ability to make it useful in your own job is really what's fueling a lot of growth in the company and just innovation and familiarity with the technology.
I was at a reception recently and I was having a conversation with two different people at the bank, and one was on the legal team, and I'm not giving away names, and one was on the model side. And they literally pulled out their phones and they were having a conversation and using the tool and then comparing, like, well, I can do this kind of query and I can find this type of thing out on the legal side, and the other on the model side was actually, expressing what he's been able to do. And they were just, it was fascinating to see two people in a, ad hoc conversation sharing how this language model that the bank has built is accessible, it's used in, sort of in real life, but, in a moment, and in the dialogue between the parts of the institution.
I think it's been the year of a massive cultural shift in people's familiarity, like, with what the capabilities are. And when we rolled this out, there was no mandate that went with it. We didn't force anybody to use the tool. We rolled it out to about 250,000 people within the company. And 150,000 people use the tool every single day. And that number has just gone up, and it continues to go up. And as we add tools and capabilities and knowledge bases, it continues to go up. And what we're seeing is we're having that message from senior leaders talking about how they're using it in their town halls. We put out a newsletter every month that has, here's the best ideas that are happening in different areas in the bank. Because while it might not be your domain area, the way that somebody is using the technology is probably the pattern is probably very transferable to what you're doing. I find that most of the impediment is not so much the lack of willingness, it's just that initial, I understand that this is amazing technology, I just don't know how to make it real in my day-to-day job. And I think giving people that, we've got some power users. There's always people that lean in and create these amazing things, and just sharing that knowledge and, like, hey, here's something that your colleague did that could be useful to you, and they're willing to talk to you about how to get that up and running. It's been really powerful.
Yeah, for sure. So definitely large institutions are embracing language models, building their own, partnering with big tech companies. Deployment is definitely happening in the financial services space. Yet we also know banking, financial services is a risk mitigation functional type of company. And obviously there are risks that have to be managed, by institutions as they are adopting these technologies. Could you share a little bit about what are some of the risk mitigation, risk management, both for the risk but also the opportunities?
Yeah, I think financial services is probably a great starting point just as we think about kind of policy discussions in this field overall, because there are some very, very well-established practices, because we are one of the few industries, I think, that has deployed this technology at scale for some time. So when you look at the risk framework that sits around our deployment of, let's just broadly say, analytics, without putting a classification on it, you're looking at things like protection of data, first and foremost. So there's some very well-established data protection paradigms. You're looking at the model itself, like how does the model work and has it been properly tested and what are the inputs and do you understand what the outputs are and are they biased or skewed in any kind of way? You're looking at the writ large technology considerations, so cyber, the infrastructure, the resiliency. And I think what has taken even a more predominant role as you look at large language models relative to some of the more traditional is that you now have to also really consider the use case. So operational risk as an overall category has always been part of the consideration, but in a world where the models are a bit more opaque, you don't understand the weights, and then we get into agentic systems that are non-deterministic, I think the previous model paradigms where it's very, very quantitatively driven are going to be less relevant in as much as you're not going to be able to have the certainty on certain things. So how do you have to shift the risk framework to account for that? And the way that we approach it is as we're deploying the technology, it's always about what is the use case on the other side. So most of the work we've done up until now has been inwardly focused. It's been inside the company, it's been relatively low risk things. We've just started doing a few things now that are more customer focused, but like we started with things like making a travel itinerary if you're calling into our Chase travel services. So this is not like making large credit decisions. This is like, let's just take it a step at a time in how we test and learn how this all works. But the use case at the end of the day is really the most important thing. Who's on the other side? What are the ramifications? And the other thing that then kicks in there is the prudential frameworks that you have around these things, right? Rather than the technology, because the technology is going to continue to evolve, what is the end protection, consumer protection, what is it that we're trying to achieve? Like fair outcomes to credit, stable capital markets, the preservation of somebody's, personal data. Those objectives don't change regardless of the technology. It's just a question of how do you ensure that you can test for those outcomes in the technology. So we've evolved the thinking in that way, but the four principles of the risk framework, I'll be honest with you, we came into the large language model conversation almost with the mindset like, well, this is different, so we'll have to come up with a new paradigm. And we wound ourselves completely back to where we started from in that the four pillars that we had are exactly the right pillars. It's just that the emphasis has maybe shifted a little bit more from the model side to the actual use case side, but they're all still valid.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And I mean, even the prior panel is starting to try to put their finger or some of the conversation around, you still have the same objectives, you still have the same legal obligations and expectations, which is in many ways, I think, an advantage for the financial services sector as a high risk, high reward sector using AI. It may have insights for other sectors as well, but yet processes inside institutions may be evolving, and obviously the regulators themselves keeping up with how are the institutions, given laws and regulations, mitigating risks and their processes around evolving their steps for making sure that the risks are understood and managed. So you started to talk about how you all have begun to, and I have to assume, test and learn how does a consumer engagement approach really work. Tell us more about sort of what you see on the horizon in terms of the possibilities for your customers moving into that space.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things that we're focused on is making sure that as we're having these conversations, the deployer voice is maybe a little bit more prominent. And what do I mean by that? I think when you look at just life as it exists today, I'm not sure that people are quite as focused on like the things that I spoke about, that when you tap your card, AI is making, you know, your life easier, it's protecting you from fraud, it's doing all of these things. So I think, you know, there are already applications where AI is very much, you know, in the real world economy, in production, and, you know, and is happening. I think where we're testing and learning is, you know, when you're working with a customer on the other side, you know, what is the transaction? So if it's something that's, you know, relatively low risk, like, you know, help me think about, you know, I want to go to Tuscany and I want it to be 5 days and I would like to do this, that will save a lot of time for everybody involved, and that's okay. If the person on the other end is, you know, making a home purchase and you're making a decision about that, that's a different paradigm, right? So we're looking at ways that this is deployed, and a lot of times this is an augmentation, right? I don't think in banking you ever will lose the personal relationship. People trust people and they deal with people. How do you make the people on our side more effective? How do you give them scale? Like, how can you actually provide services at a much greater scale and maybe to different parts of the economy than we have been able to do previously? So whether that's in, you know, financial advice or being ahead of the curve, like in recent market volatility that we saw back in the springtime, our advisors were able to make proactive calls to their client base because they had AI helping them, not because AI is facing the customer, but because AI is looking at the market moves, looking at the news, looking at the customer portfolios, looking at what your objectives are, and saying, this is a call that you need to make. Before the person calls you incoming, like, give them the call proactively because it's probably causing them some anxiety, and give them some advice about how that's going to work. So I think we see that this is just a way of like really creating that much more scale and access in a lot of ways that, you know, you can process more data, you can do more things at a greater scale.
Yeah, I'm just struck by it would be interesting if someone could actually evaluate what the benefit, what the advantage was of the intelligence and the ease and because, I mean, there was a week, right, when we were all going, what's happening with the market and where are things going? And so if there was the ability to do some level of assessment with the AI tool and try to stay ahead of it. So it's an interesting example. Mm-hmm. So the technology, it's rapidly evolving. We've been hearing this in the news and all morning long. How do you see the advances in AI over the forthcoming 3 to 5 years affecting the bank and frankly affecting the broader financial services sector? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think if you look at the arc, at least from my perspective, that we've been on, and again, being 2 years into the job, I feel like I've lived multiple technology cycles in a lifetime of technology cycles. It's only been 2 years. You know, first you have the advent of like the ChatGPT that all of a sudden democratized this amazing technology and put it in business people's hands, right? And then very quickly, now we've like gotten to the next level where it's not so much like just a dialogue that you're having with the model. The models themselves are much better at thinking. They can reason. You can give them a complex problem the same way you can give to a person, and they can say, all right, here's how I'm going to go about it. This is where I'm going to get my information from. These are the tools I'm going to use. So all of a sudden now you have these much more impactful workflows, right? The technology is there. So like, that's what I tell my colleagues within the bank all the time. The technology has actually outpaced our ability at this point to absorb it. And what do I mean by that? I mean that you also now have to start reimagining the way that you work. Right? Up until now, it's been, okay, here's how I do my job, and I'm putting this conversation that you're having between the legal people and whatever in the company. There's this really, you know, troublesome thing that I do every day that's just annoying, and I would rather not do it. And so I stuck AI in there, and it makes it go that much faster. That's great. But it's a point in the chain. Now you have to actually step back and say, when I pose the question, what would happen if I could give you 100 more employees at a zero cost? Or what would happen if like all of a sudden the marginal cost of your next transaction was zero? Like how does that change the calculus about how you think about your business, and how do you kind of think about if you could do things that are linear and parallel, how does that work? And that is now more of a cultural training type of an initiative, where it's less about so much that you need to be an expert on AI. You have to know your domain, and you have to know what's capable in the technology. But you also have to actually take a step back and think about, if I was going to transform this process, if I wasn't hindered by the way things have always been, how would I think about it from start to finish? Who are the stakeholders? What do they need? If I wasn't constrained, what would I do? And that, I think, is going to be, the next wave. If you're asking me like what I would love to see next year I would love to be talking less about the technology and more about like, here's how we transformed end-to-end credit, or here's how we can, exactly, much more of a strategic conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's almost, a couple of years ago, there was a conversation, one of the podcasts, and one of the big technology companies was saying, we are going to move away from prompt engineering. Like the machines are going to be so capable. And that does lead us to, it's not just how am I doing my job, but strategy overall. So we do have policymakers in the room, and they are grappling with how do we evolve, how do we keep up with, how do we understand the technology and how the financial institutions are using it. Would love your perspective on, is there balancing innovation, risk management, new market opportunities, any words of wisdom you would give them, and also any thoughts you have on, and this is a theme obviously, dialogue, partnerships with regulators and industry and research organizations. You want to sum all that up, and then we'll let people go to lunch.
Okay. Well, first, I don't envy you. This is a complex space, and first of all, I also want to thank you, because we've had lots of engagement, and I think that's the only way that we're going to progress here. Like, this has to be a shared initiative across the public, private, academic sector. Like, we're all going to have to lean into this because it's new territory. I think what we're seeing, and we touched a little bit on this, is I think you have to almost look at a sectoral basis, right? So I think you have to look at what is the industry, what are the characteristics of that, what are the existing frameworks, because that is a great base to start from, and I think that that's a concern, that all of a sudden you get this sweeping horizontal view that, in some way is going to negate that. I do think, though, you have to think about how the infrastructure, the ecosystem has changed. You have new players in the ecosystem, and those new players are going to become increasingly part of the, they're very important, they're playing important roles. So what are the roles and responsibilities of everybody within that dynamic? How do we ensure that we have the right levels of transparency? The technology is only useful, the technology is only good if it's used, right? And it's only going to be used if it's solving real problems for real people and people trust it. And so it's in our best interest to make sure that we are looking at what are those risks, how do we put the right constraints around that, and if there's one thing that I would really emphasize, and I think we largely share this objective, is to the greatest extent we can have frameworks that are harmonized. It's very difficult to promote this type of innovation and growth that I think we all think is possible with the technology if we have very fragmented approaches. JPMorgan operates in over 100 countries around the world. We operate in all 48 contiguous states. We serve 80 million households in the United States. If we have to start looking at differences of how we offer products and services at a very finite level, it's very difficult, and I think it will impede our ability as a country, honestly, in how we show up and compete and actually deploy the technology.
I think that's spot on, and I think it does speak to the need for hearing from the different perspectives. There are state-level efforts where they're thinking hard about wanting to make sure that people, children, federally, there are agendas around protecting people in the AI context, but being able to bring in what are the different objectives of the different policy communities so that we can find common ground and agreement. and then have consistency in terms of the expectations and obligations. So,
and many of those protections are protections that I think we would want to have regardless for all of our citizens, regardless of what state they're living in. So I think it's just finding those common grounds, those sensible outcomes, and being very thoughtful about that, and engaging conversations like this and continuing to work together to solve this.
well, thank you. If you all will join me in thanking Teresa. Really appreciate it.